The soft rustle of papers echoed through the hallways of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou as President Ibrahim Traoré reviewed another sleepless night's work. The air was thick with tension. A sealed envelope, stamped "Classified Urgent," lay before him on the polished surface of his desk. The document had arrived just hours earlier from the newly formed National Committee for Financial Transparency, a body he himself had created 3 weeks ago to audit all foreign financial dealings. He opened it slowly, expecting standard figures and jargon. What he read instead was a staggering exposé of corruption, fraud, and betrayal. Mr. President, the accompanying note from the head of the committee read, "What we have uncovered may be the largest financial deception ever inflicted upon Burkina Faso, possibly upon the whole of Africa." The committee, led by the brilliant economist Professor Mamadou Diabaté, had analyzed thousands of contracts, loan agreements, bank transfers, and secret memoranda stretching back over 6 decades. The numbers were clear and devastating. Burkina Faso, a nation rich in gold, manganese, and culture, had paid over $20 billion in debt repayments to the World Bank and its affiliated institutions. Yet the country's national debt stood at $4 billion. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. President Traoré stood silently as the weight of the revelation pressed down on him. For years, his people had suffered under austerity programs, budget cuts, and the endless cycle of foreign development aid that never seemed to develop anything. Schools were falling apart, hospitals had no supplies, and millions remained unemployed. Now the truth was laid bare. The money had never truly reached the people. It had been siphoned away through a rigged system designed to keep them enslaved. A thick report laid out specific examples. Hospitals budgeted and funded through World Bank loans that were never built. Road projects that existed only in documentation, complete with invoices and photoshopped progress images. Even fake energy contracts, where payments were made but no equipment ever arrived. Dozens of such ghost projects accounted for billions in missing funds. But the most explosive discovery lay at the back of the file, a confidential agreement signed in 2018 by Traoré's predecessor. According to this document, 35% of Burkina Faso's gold reserves had been used as collateral for a development stabilization package from the World Bank. No parliamentary approval, no public announcement, just a hidden agreement, trading away national treasure for phantom promises. Traoré clenched his fists. "This isn't debt," he muttered under his breath. "It's robbery." Within the hour, he summoned Professor Diabaté to the palace. When the professor arrived, visibly exhausted but energized by the gravity of their findings, Traoré asked just one question. "How deep does this go?" Diabaté didn't hesitate. "It's global. The same pattern repeats across Africa. Burkina Faso isn't alone, Mr. President. We're just the first to prove it." Traoré turned to the window, his eyes scanning the bustling streets of Ouagadougou below. Children walked to school barefoot, vendors fought over pennies. Entire neighborhoods lived without electricity, and yet they had paid more in interest to foreign institutions than they had invested in their own country. A storm of emotions surged through him. Rage, sorrow, but also clarity. "We have to act," he said. "Mr. President?" Diabaté asked cautiously. "Prepare a press briefing. I'm going to confront them directly. No more games, no more secret deals. I want the regional director of the World Bank in my office by morning." "Yes, sir. Should I contact the Ministry of Foreign Affairs?" "No," Traoré replied firmly. "Contact military intelligence. If he won't come willingly, we'll bring him in ourselves." The morning was unusually still in the capital city. Outside the gates of the presidential compound, armored vehicles took discreet positions, and plainclothes security personnel were stationed at key junctions. President Ibrahim Traoré was not taking any chances. Today was not a day for diplomacy. It was a day for reckoning. At exactly 8:45 a.m., the armored SUV carrying Antoine Lambert, the World Bank's West Africa regional director, crossed into the palace grounds. Lambert, a seasoned economist with decades of experience, had faced dozens of meetings with African leaders. He thought he knew what to expect: some pressure over loan conditions, a bit of political posturing, perhaps a photo op. But this felt different. There were no smiles, no photographers, no opening ceremonies, only silence. Inside, President Traoré stood waiting, dressed in his military fatigues and signature red beret. His arms were crossed behind his back, posture stiff, expression unreadable. The long oak table in front of him was buried under stacks of files, each tagged, highlighted, and indexed. To Lambert, it looked less like a meeting and more like a tribunal. "Mr. Lambert," Traore said calmly as the man entered the room, "take a seat." Lambert hesitated for half a second before sitting down. A member of Traore's security team closed the door and remained stationed by it. The president began without pleasantries. "Everything in these files details financial crimes committed under the guise of development assistance, fraudulent loans, fictitious infrastructure, and worst of all, secret agreements that handed over our nation's sovereignty to your institution." Lambert raised an eyebrow. "Mr. President, I assure you, the World Bank operates under strict oversight and compliance standards. If there have been irregularities—" Traore slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the chamber. "Irregularities? You call pledging our national gold reserves without parliamentary approval an irregularity?" He slid a document across the table. Lambert picked it up, scanning the contents quickly, and froze. It was a signed protocol from 2018, stamped confidential. The president's eyes didn't leave his. "That document was never supposed to surface," Lambert finally admitted. "But it did," Traore replied coldly. "And with it, everything else. We've traced payments from your so-called loans that went directly to foreign shell companies. We found records of bribes to our former ministers, and media contracts designed to manipulate public opinion and silence dissent." Lambert's confident demeanor began to crack. Sweat formed on his temples despite the room's cool air. "There are channels for these matters, Mr. President. You could have gone to international arbitration." "Arbitration?" Traore snapped. "We've been arbitrated into poverty for 60 years. That ends now." He stood, his towering presence filling the room with energy. "You will answer for these crimes, Mr. Lambert, not just to me, but to my people and to the world." The World Bank director tried to reassert control. "I am a protected diplomatic official. Any actions taken against me could have severe consequences. Economic sanctions, legal action, isolation." Traore walked around the table, standing directly behind Lambert. "You and your colleagues have sanctioned our futures. You've legally looted our wealth. You've isolated us from our own prosperity. Tell me, Mr. Lambert, what more do we have to lose?" Silence. "I'm giving you a chance," Traore continued. "Call your superiors. Tell them what we've found. Tell them what we demand. We want the immediate cancellation of all illegitimate debts. We want the return of every dollar stolen through fraud. And we want it in writing, within 24 hours. Lambert stared at the documents in front of him. He knew what they meant, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire model the World Bank had operated under in Africa for decades. If one country exposed it, others would follow. "This will cause a chain reaction," he said. "Good," Traore replied. "It's time the chains were broken." News travels fast in the digital age, but in Africa, where word of mouth still holds unmatched power, it moves even faster when truth is finally spoken. By noon, the corridors of Ouagadougou buzzed with a single name: Ibrahim Traoré. The leaked footage of his confrontation with Antoine Lambert had already gone viral. A 5-minute clip, edited from palace security footage, showed Traoré slamming the damning protocol onto the table and declaring the end of economic servitude. The words echoed like thunder across the continent. "No more debts, no more lies. We are taking back what was stolen." The impact was immediate. University campuses erupted into spontaneous rallies. In Thomas Sankara Square, thousands gathered waving flags, singing revolutionary songs that had not been heard since the days of Pan-African resistance. Market vendors abandoned their stalls to join. Civil servants walked out of government buildings to participate. From the highlands of Bobo Dioulasso to the dusty outskirts of Koudougou, the nation was awake, alive, with pride, anger, and unshakable resolve. Across the continent, the clip spread like fire on dry savanna. In Dakar, young Senegalese held up signs that read, "We are next." In Lagos, activists chanted outside the National Assembly, "If Burkina Faso can do it, so can we." In Bamako, the Malian government issued a formal statement of support. "The time for colonial finance is over. We stand with President Traoré." Social media exploded. Hashtags like Africa Rises, Debt is Theft, and Traoré Truth trended across platforms. Influencers, musicians, athletes, people with millions of followers, shared the footage with messages of unity and defiance. But the biggest surprise came from within the elite. Several former ministers in neighboring countries began leaking documents anonymously confirming similar schemes. Loan funds redirected, natural resources pledged without approval, ghost projects repeated with precision. The pattern was unmistakable, and the corruption systemic. Back in Ouagadougou, the presidential office turned into a war room. Mr. President, Professor Diabate reported, "We've been contacted by whistleblowers from 4 other nations. They want to provide us with evidence of the same mechanisms at play in their countries." "Collect everything," Traore ordered. "We're building a case not just for ourselves, but for all of Africa." He paced slowly across the polished stone floor of the palace, his mind racing. He knew what would come next: retaliation. And sure enough, it came. By evening, statements began to pour in from Western capitals. A spokesperson from the U.S. State Department urged calm and respect for established financial frameworks. The European Commission warned that unilateral cancellation of sovereign debts may trigger global instability. France's foreign ministry called the confrontation unconstructive and dangerous. But none of it mattered, because Traoré had something they feared more than instability: momentum. "Let them panic," he told his chief of staff. "They've ruled Africa through fear for decades, but now they fear us." The World Bank's headquarters in Washington entered full crisis mode. Emergency meetings, back-channel phone calls, offers of private negotiations all came in within 24 hours. Traoré refused them all. "We negotiate in public now," he announced on state television. "Our people deserve to see every word. We will no longer sign our futures away behind closed doors." Then came the flashpoint. That night, an encrypted message reached Traoré's intelligence chief. Antoine Lambert had attempted to flee. A private jet was waiting at a remote airstrip outside Ouagadougou. The order was swift and uncompromising: stop him. Special forces moved silently and efficiently. They intercepted Lambert before he reached the aircraft, seizing his phone, his documents, and his passport. He was escorted back to the palace and placed under house arrest. The next morning, Traoré addressed the nation. "My fellow citizens, Antoine Lambert, representative of the World Bank, attempted to escape justice. He has been detained and will face the law, our law. We will not be silenced. We will not be bribed. We will not be broken." The crowd roared. Across Burkina Faso, people celebrated in the streets as if liberation had already been achieved. Children painted Traoré's face on walls. Women ululated in celebration. The old sang songs they never thought they'd hear again. And around the world, the establishment trembled, because a leader had emerged, one who could not be bought, could not be swayed, and could not be stopped. The world had not seen anything like it in decades. A sitting African president had defied a cornerstone of the global financial order, and instead of collapsing under pressure, he was growing stronger by the hour. From Harare to Algiers, from Kinshasa to Addis Ababa, a new kind of energy was awakening. Ibrahim Traoré's actions had torn through the psychological chains of financial colonialism, and the aftershocks were being felt everywhere. In the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, a high-level emergency session was convened for the first time in years without foreign observers present. 41 out of 55 member nations voted to establish an independent commission to investigate World Bank activities on the continent. It was an unprecedented move. African finance ministers, normally cautious, often complicit, began whispering in hallways and meeting in backrooms. The question was on everyone's lips. What if Traoré is right? What if we've all been robbed in plain sight? And the documents Traoré released gave them reason to believe. Each scanned page posted by the Burkina presidency told a chilling story. African nations signing away billions under false pretenses. Development loans used to fund fake projects. National resources mortgaged for infrastructure that never existed. Contracts signed in secret. Bribes logged with names, dates, and amounts. Then came the proof of psychological warfare. Internal World Bank memos instructing media partners to manage public expectations, advising how to neutralize opposition voices by exploiting tribal divisions, and strategies to portray any dissenting African leader as unstable, populist, or authoritarian. These revelations sent shockwaves through African societies. In Nairobi, university students filled Uhuru Park chanting, "Cancel the lies." In Lagos, Traore doctrine became the top trending tag. In Kinshasa, trade unions threatened a general strike if debt reviews weren't initiated immediately. But the resistance was not only digital or symbolic. In Togo, citizens surrounded the World Bank offices and demanded transparency. In Zambia, a group of retired civil servants began releasing their own cache of documents, evidence they had collected over the years but were too afraid to share. Meanwhile, Western powers went into full-blown containment mode. The IMF issued a carefully worded statement warning of irresponsible debt denouncement that could destabilize global markets. NATO intelligence branches began classifying Burkina Faso as a red zone for influence loss. The French presidency sent envoys disguised as mediators, delivering a veiled threat. "Stability is fragile. You should tread carefully, Mr. President." Traoré was unmoved. In a defiant televised address, he said, "We are not destabilizing Africa. We are destabilizing the systems that have kept Africa in chains. There is a difference. Let it be known, we are not afraid of sanctions, because the real sanctions were poverty, debt, and humiliation, and we've lived under them for 60 years. The speech electrified the continent. Within hours, Mali's President Issa Doumbia announced the cancellation of all new World Bank negotiations. Niger's transitional government declared a moratorium on debt payments until a continental audit was complete. Guinea's government nationalized 2 key gold mines previously under foreign control. Even long-silent Ethiopia issued a public statement calling for a rethinking of the entire global lending structure. Back in Burkina Faso, the palace transformed into a command center for a movement larger than any nation. Intelligence reports flowed in constantly. New leaks were arriving daily from anonymous insiders across Africa. The documents were damning: bribes, assassination lists, even plans for orchestrated coups if leaders resisted economic control. "Look at this," Traoré said to Professor Diabate as he read a decrypted message from an ex-World Bank staffer. They had code names for every African president: compliant, underwatch, hostile. They were running a shadow empire. But Traoré was no longer just reading evidence. He was preparing action. "We will take this to The Hague," he declared. "If they won't come to justice, we will bring justice to them. The world must see that economic crimes are crimes all the same." And so began preparations for the most ambitious legal action in African history. A lawsuit filed not by one country, but by a bloc of sovereign nations against a global financial institution. The first draft was titled "The People of Africa versus the World Bank." It was a moment the colonizers never expected and one they were utterly unprepared for. The continent was no longer begging for scraps. It was organizing, it was uniting, and it was coming. The world held its breath. It had been exactly 24 hours since President Ibrahim Traoré had issued the ultimatum to the World Bank: cancel the illegitimate debts and return what was stolen, or face the consequences. As the final moments ticked away, the question was no longer whether Traoré was bluffing, but how far he was willing to go. The answer came at 12 p.m. local time. Antoine Lambert, the World Bank's West Africa regional director, was led from the presidential guest residence in handcuffs by members of Burkina Faso's Special Security Division. The images were broadcast live on national television. A foreign diplomat, once untouchable, now exposed before the eyes of millions. Lambert's face was pale, his eyes darting between cameras and guards, the reality of his fate settling like concrete in his bones. As he was placed into an armored transport vehicle, reporters shouted questions. He said nothing. The footage spread globally within minutes. CNN breaking: World Bank official arrested in Burkina Faso, unprecedented diplomatic incident. BBC World: crisis in West Africa, Traoré detains key World Bank representative over alleged economic crimes. Al Jazeera: Africa rising, Traoré's arrest order sends shockwaves through global finance. But while the Western media focused on crisis and instability, Africans saw something entirely different: justice. In Ghana, crowds cheered in Accra's Independence Square. In Mozambique, demonstrators marched toward the parliament, demanding a full audit of all IMF loans. In Tanzania, a new political movement was launched on live TV: Enough is Enough, Vijana wa Africa. And inside the African Union headquarters, the tone changed dramatically. What began as cautious observation became open support. A motion was passed with overwhelming majority. We recognize the sovereign right of African states to hold foreign institutions accountable for economic exploitation, and hereby support Burkina Faso's legal proceedings. Meanwhile, at the Élysée Palace in Paris, President Emmanuel Macron convened an emergency session with his Africa policy advisors. This cannot stand, Macron said. If Traoré succeeds, France loses control, not just in Burkina Faso, but across Francophone Africa. You know what that means for the CFA Franc system. Across the Atlantic, Washington reacted with barely contained fury. State Department spokespersons issued stern warnings, demanding the immediate release of the diplomat and threatening serious consequences for any violation of international conventions. But Ibrahim Traoré was unfazed. He stood before a wall of cameras, the Burkinabe flag behind him, and delivered one of the most decisive speeches of the century. Antoine Lambert is not a diplomat. He is a financier of neocolonialism. His immunity does not extend to crimes against humanity. Our evidence is irrefutable. He will face a tribunal, and the world will finally see what has been done to Africa behind closed doors. He held up a thick folder stamped confidential. Inside this file are 342 pages of documented fraud, deception, and betrayal. Road projects funded but never built. Hospitals approved but never constructed. Gold reserves used as collateral in secret. We have every receipt, every transfer, every lie. The press room erupted. Reporters from Kenya, South Africa, Algeria, and Nigeria pushed forward to capture every word. Traoré wasn't just exposing the World Bank, he was dismantling the myth that global institutions served justice. The reactions were swift. China's foreign ministry. Burkina Faso exercises its sovereignty. We respect its legal actions. Kremlin statement. This confirms what we have long stated. International institutions operate as instruments of financial colonization. President Lula. The struggle of Burkina Faso is the struggle of the global South. Prime Minister Modi. India stands with those who demand economic fairness in the post-colonial world. But not all reactions were political. Wall Street felt it too. Within hours of Lambert's arrest, World Bank stocks dipped 14%. Credit rating agencies downgraded the risk profile of African investments. Hedge funds began pulling capital from sub-Saharan projects. Panic set in, not because Africa was unstable, but because Africa was standing up. Inside the palace, Traoré remained calm. Let them panic, he told his economic advisors. We've panicked for 60 years. It's their turn now. That evening, the president received a report from his intelligence chief. It contained decrypted emails recovered from Lambert's confiscated laptop. What they revealed was staggering. A network of African leaders labeled as assets, covert payments funneled through offshore entities, internal World Bank discussions about destabilizing regimes that resisted policy alignment, drafts of smear campaigns against journalists and whistleblowers. Traoré sat in silence for a long time, absorbing every word. This is more than debt, he finally said. This is war. And just like that, he gave the order that would send shockwaves far beyond the continent. Prepare the tribunal. Lambert will stand trial, and every document we've uncovered, every lie, every dollar, every betrayal, will be presented before the African people and the world. The trial had not yet begun, but the verdict was already being written in the streets of Africa. As Antoine Lambert remained in custody, his laptop's secrets now in the hands of investigators, President Ibrahim Traoré's revolution evolved from a national act of defiance into a full-scale continental movement. What began as a confrontation with one institution had now become a continent-wide reckoning with the entire architecture of global economic control. And it was spreading like wildfire. In Senegal, a coalition of university professors, economists, and civil society leaders presented their own report to Parliament titled The Debt Trap, a Post-Colonial Engine. It cited Burkina Faso as a case study and demanded a national audit within 30 days. In Cameroon, the opposition forced an emergency debate in Parliament, waving printouts of the Burkina Faso files in the air as proof of a hidden war on African prosperity. In Côte d'Ivoire, mass demonstrations shut down government buildings for 3 days, calling for the immediate withdrawal from World Bank and IMF lending agreements. In Mali, President Doumbia called for the creation of a new African financial court based in Bamako, where crimes of economic sabotage and neocolonial interference could be prosecuted by Africans, for Africans. Meanwhile, the African Union was no longer silent. The Emergency Continental Finance Summit in Addis Ababa, dubbed the New Independence Congress, brought together leaders from 37 African nations. For 3 days, they met behind closed doors, examining the evidence shared by Traoré's administration. When the summit concluded, a single declaration was issued. The African Union hereby launches the Continental Commission for Financial Sovereignty. All international debt agreements signed without full democratic oversight shall be reviewed. The era of blind compliance is over. We are no longer colonies. We are no longer prey. The statement was not just symbolic, it was structural. The Commission's first act was to freeze all new World Bank loan signings across the continent for 90 days pending forensic audits. This sent global markets into convulsions. Investment banks declared Africa unpredictable. Bloomberg warned of a monetary realignment in sub-Saharan risk zones. Goldman Sachs advised clients to brace for sovereign defaults. But in Africa, it didn't feel like default. It felt like freedom. Back in Ouagadougou, the presidential palace had become the beating heart of the movement. Foreign journalists camped outside for days, trying to get quotes, trying to understand. Inside, Traoré's team was assembling the trial of the century. A team of African legal experts from South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, and even the African diaspora in the US and UK had volunteered to take part. Their mission was clear: prove that what had been done to Africa wasn't mismanagement. It was deliberate. "This isn't a court case," said Chief Prosecutor Aminata Bello of Nigeria. "This is the Nuremberg of finance." And as the trial preparations moved forward, President Traoré began building something even more radical: a Pan-African economic coalition, not just as a protest, but as an alternative. His plan included a continental sovereign fund backed by African resources: gold, oil, cocoa, lithium, not foreign reserves; a new currency to replace the CFA Franc and other colonial-era monetary systems, developed with support from tech experts in Ghana and blockchain engineers in Kenya; an infrastructure bank, founded by African nations, not for profit, but for power grids, roads, and digital networks connecting Africans to each other, not to export routes. The name of this vision, the Sankara Initiative. Named after the revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara, murdered for challenging imperialist economics, it would be everything he dreamed of and more: African-built, African-funded, African-run. Outside the palace, the people responded with overwhelming support. Songs were written. Portraits of Traoré now stood beside Nkrumah, Lumumba, Sankara, and Mandela in murals painted across the continent. In Lagos, a rapper released a track called "Cancel the Chains." In Accra, schoolchildren performed plays reenacting the Lambert arrest as a turning point in African history. And yet, the danger grew. Western intelligence reports, leaked by sympathetic insiders, showed that plans were being drafted to isolate Burkina Faso economically and politically. Rumors swirled of mercenary operations. Media smear campaigns had already begun, painting Traoré as another populist autocrat who would ruin the economy and destabilize the region. But Traoré knew better, and he had a message for them. Let them come with their narratives. Let them come with their mercenaries. We have something they will never understand: truth and unity. And that, my brothers and sisters, is bulletproof. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, the city pulsed with a rhythm not heard in decades, the sound of liberation in motion. Inside the palace, as night fell, Ibrahim Traoré stood before a map of Africa. On it were pinned red dots, each one a nation where resistance had begun. He smiled. "This," he whispered, "is only the beginning." The world had changed, but most of it didn't realize it yet. In the heart of Ouagadougou, in a courtroom constructed within the walls of the old colonial administrative hall, the trial of Antoine Lambert began. But it wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was an exorcism, a public cleansing of 6 decades of quiet exploitation dressed as diplomacy. The opening statement by Chief Prosecutor Aminata Bello was broadcast across the continent, simultaneously translated into Arabic, Swahili, French, English, Hausa, and Wolof. "This man is not alone in the dock," she declared. "What sits here is a system, cold, calculated, and concealed. A system that bled Africa dry behind spreadsheets, that built phantom hospitals on paper and debt prisons in reality. Today, we put the system on trial." The evidence came in waves. Screens displayed internal memos, wire transfers, testimonies from whistleblowers, and forensic analyses. Project by project, it was revealed that over $230 billion had been siphoned from Africa in the last 25 years through rigged financial architecture. Each nation had its story. Tanzania, ghost roads with $400 million in loans. Ghana, hospital equipment never delivered, $120 million missing. Chad, loans collateralized with oil fields secretly sold to offshore firms. Mozambique, fisheries loaned for $2 billion, never built, never explained. International observers were stunned. Even hardened reporters who'd covered war and famine sat in silence, shaken not by what they saw, but by how systemically invisible it had all been made. And in the final moments of the prosecution, Traoré himself took the stand, not as a politician, but as a witness. He told the court about the day he opened the first classified envelope, about the sleepless nights reading every forged agreement, about the names, African names, signed beneath contracts of betrayal. And then he paused, looking straight into the cameras, and spoke to the world. You taught us to believe our chains were invisible. You taught us to doubt our pain, but we have learned. We are no longer ashamed of being poor. We are ashamed we allowed ourselves to be robbed. The room erupted. Crowds outside the courthouse cheered with tears in their eyes. In every corner of Africa, people stopped what they were doing to watch. Bus drivers in Nairobi, fishermen in Dakar, factory workers in Johannesburg, farmers in Kinshasa. For a brief moment, 1.4 billion people shared a single breath. And the verdict? Guilty. Antoine Lambert was found guilty of economic war crimes, conspiracy to undermine sovereign governance, and financial crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to 25 years in an international African correctional facility, pending further proceedings on wider networks. But this was never about prison. This was about power. Within 48 hours, the dominoes fell. World Bank offices in 5 African capitals were shut down. France's CFA Franc lost legitimacy in 8 countries. Pan-African leaders launched the Africoin, Africa's first decentralized gold-backed currency. The Sahel Energy Grid project, long dormant, was resurrected with funding from a new coalition of African states and BRICS partners. UN votes called for investigations into financial practices of Bretton Woods institutions. Burkina Faso, once seen as a tiny, impoverished, landlocked state, had become the gravitational center of a geopolitical shift, not through war, not through weapons, but through truth. And in response, the old powers tried everything. Sanctions, ignored. Media attacks, drowned out by African digital armies. Assassination attempts, thwarted by loyal military units who had sworn allegiance not just to Traoré, but to the cause. The world's economic system trembled, not because of instability, but because Africa had withdrawn its silent compliance. It had chosen sovereignty over subservience. And then came the final act. Traoré called an open-air assembly in Thomas Sankara Square. Over 250,000 people filled the plaza. Flags from every African nation flew side by side. Children climbed on rooftops to see. Drones hovered overhead. Every screen on the continent broadcast the event live. Traoré stepped forward in full uniform, then removed his beret, setting it on the podium. He paused, and then he spoke. My people, my brothers and sisters of Africa, we are no longer waiting for freedom. We are building it. The age of foreign creditors deciding our fate is over. The age of shameful deals in exchange for imaginary progress is over. The age of begging is over. From this day forward, let it be known, Africa does not owe. Africa is owed, and we have just begun to collect. The square exploded with chants. Africa rises. Traoré, one Africa, free Africa. Tears flowed, drums echoed, the earth itself seemed to respond. This was not the end, this was the beginning. The day Africa stopped asking permission, the day Africa reclaimed her name, the day the world began to answer for its crimes. And the man who lit the fuse, President Ibrahim Traoré. Not just a head of state, but a symbol, a warning, a dawn.